The work of an intellectual is not to mold the political will of others, it is, through the analyses that he does in his own field, to re-examine evidence and assumptions, to shake up habitual ways of working and thinking, to dissipate conventional familiarities, to re-evaluate rules and institutions, and to participate in the formation of a political will, where he has his role as citizen to play. Michel Foucault, The Concern for Truth. The real political task in a society such as ours is to criticize the workings of institutions that appear to be both neutral and independent, to criticize and attack them in such a manner that the political violence that has always exercised itself obscurely through them will be unmasked, so that one can fight against them. Michel Foucault, Human Nature, Justice versus Power. My point is that the mainstream press in countries such as Sweden, the United States and the United Kingdom, have, more often than not, failed to engage in critical investigations into, and analyses of, the accumulation and utilization of power. So, what does this have to do with journalism? A lot, I would argue. Many of the issues with which we should associate academia, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, critical thinking, keeping an eye on authority, education, are issues historically linked to journalism. Thus, just as it is important to ask to what extent we as academics have investigated, questioned and challenged the distribution and use of social, economic and military power in society, so, of course, should we ask the same of the news organizations described as watchdogs and guardians. My point is that the mainstream press in countries such as Sweden, the United States and the United Kingdom, have, more often than not, failed to engage in critical investigations into, and analyses of, the accumulation and utilization of power. And, it is this failure that has created a vacuum filled, at least in part, by WikiLeaks and Anonymous. If we are looking for an obvious example of such a failure of critical analysis, one need only look to the attacks by a number of U.S. journalists upon fellow journalist Glenn Greenwald, for a particularly devastating exchange. See Greenwald's response to Washington Post columnist Walter Pincus, and source Edward Snowden following their revelations of domestic and international surveillance by the U.S. government. In Sweden, the Swedish vetoing, together with the UK, of EU discussions with the US over those same NSA revelations has been met by relative silence in the Swedish media. There is, however, a second premise to this post, and that is that in our discussion of groups such as WikiLeaks or Anonymous, emphasis is often placed squarely upon their use of technology, rather than the socio-political and cultural motivations behind their actions. This technocentrism, I would argue, deflects a measure of critique away from mainstream journalism, and explains the rise of groups such as WikiLeaks and Anonymous as predominantly technological phenomena. In other words, they exist because the technology allows them to exist. To get back to Foucault, his suggestion that we need to criticize the workings of institutions that appear to be both neutral and independent is vital, in particular, his choice of the word workings, because it points to a central idea, namely the importance of process. Where contemporary journalism has failed, I would argue, is in the lack of exposure and lack of analysis of the mechanisms of power that Foucault discusses. These are mechanisms that are neither sexy nor exciting, and can be mind-numbing in terms of the minutiae of political, legal, diplomatic or technological details. These details are, however, the building blocks of real power, blocks mostly obscured from public view under a veneer of PR, spin, infotainment and event-based news coverage. Over the past few years, and to varied levels of success and impact, groups such as Anonymous and WikiLeaks have peeled back this veneer, exposing activities that are both shocking and banal. In his powerful testimony of July 10, 2013 at the Bradley Manning trial, Harvard law professor Yake Bankler outlined precisely why he feels that WikiLeaks is not only a complement to journalism, but part of journalism itself, shining a light on processes otherwise hidden from the general public. From the unofficial court transcript. Q. Is WikiLeaks a member of the networked Fourth Estate? A. Bankler, absolutely. Q. Why do you believe that? A. Benkler, it is, journalism is made up of many things. WikiLeaks doesn't do interviews and pound the pavement. Again, when we say WikiLeaks, we're really talking about before the severe degradation that followed the attack on the organization that we described just before. WikiLeaks was a solution to a very particular and critical component of the way in which investigative journalism, muckraking can find instances of corruption. We don't only live from Pentagon Papers or Watergate or the NSA wiretapping scandals of 2005 and the more recent months. But it's a clear, distinct component of what in the history of journalism we see as high points, where journalists are able to come in and say, here's a system operating in a way that is obscure to the public and now we're able to shine the light. That's what WikiLeaks showed how to do for the network public sphere. WikiLeaks may fail in the future because of all these events, but the model of some form of decentralized leaking, that is secure technologically and allows for collaboration among different media in different countries, that's going to survive and somebody else will build it. But WikiLeaks played that critical role of that particular critical component of what muckraking and investigative journalism has always done. WikiLeaks and Anonymous are an expression, a crystallization of a dissatisfaction with the extent to which primarily commercial, but also public service, news organizations have willingly absorbed elite discourses in relation to socio-economic, legal and military issues. While it would be a stretch to say that September 11, 2001 was the genesis date for groups such as WikiLeaks and Anonymous, it would nevertheless be fair to suggest that the range of domestic, U.S., and geopolitical events that followed those attacks 12 years ago had a profound effect upon global activism, from the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the occupations of those two countries, Abu Ghraib, Guantanamo, the Bush presidency, the London and Madrid bombings, the global war on terror, the Patriot Act, to PRISM. In all of these cases, from the attacks themselves to the passage of restrictive censorship and privacy legislation, an understanding of workings and process was, and remains, fundamental. As the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan dragged on, it became clear that citizens also had little understanding of the mechanisms of the politics of war or the U.S. legal system. As hundreds of billions of dollars were spent by the Bush and Obama administrations on the war effort, media still focused on surges and attacks, not corrupt no-bid contracts offered to former business partners of Vice President Dick Cheney. And, as the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay Prison have passed the 150th day of their hunger striking, the limited amount of time spent by the media addressing the very legality of the prison, and the treatment of the prisoners, has become painfully apparent. For both WikiLeaks and Anonymous, there is a commitment to expose corporate and state abuses of power, often by exposing the very mechanisms by which such power is exercised. The leak, hacking and publication of emails, internal documents and memos, military videos, diplomatic cables, bank accounts in the service of increased transparency, as well as the protesting surveillance or censorship, has caused concern for corporations and state institutions. WikiLeaks and Anonymous are an expression, a crystallization of a dissatisfaction with the extent to which primarily commercial, but also public service, news organizations have willingly absorbed elite discourses in relation to socio-economic, legal and military issues. Stories which expose political or corporate misconduct should not to be seen as the antithesis to these discourses. Often, such instances are simply defined as the exceptions that prove the rule while the greater meta-story of capitalism and Western power remain unchallenged. For example, the rhetoric of Sweden as a neutral country with a primary interest in diplomacy hides, to a certain extent, the economic and political power held by large corporations in this country, corporations involved in business activities antithetical to both democratic development and peaceful resolutions of disputes. The cloudy role of the Swedish government in protecting Ericsson's interests in Syria, for example, while covered by Dagens Nyheter and Swedish radio, received relatively little press coverage, given how it clashed with so much of the political discourse coming out of Stockholm regarding a commitment to freedom of speech and the rule of law. Again, while stories on surveillance and weapons manufacture are broken, deeper analyses of how the stories relate to power remain, for the most part, unwritten. But, this post is not about the death of journalism, but rather a particular failure, the failure to address process and context. Yet, the work of both Anonymous and WikiLeaks should be seen as positive developments for journalism, as they introduce new elements into the informational and democratic landscape. Ultimately, what is challenged by WikiLeaks and Anonymous is not so much the mode of news and information production and distribution, but rather the relationship between mass media and those holding political economic power. WikiLeaks and Anonymous force us to rethink a number of core democratic relationships, the one between citizens and the state, impacted by providing access to sensitive intelligence previously hidden from view, the one between citizens and the media, impacted by exposure of the shortcomings of an uncritical commercial media system, and, the one between media and governments, impacted by challenging the mantle of watchdog proudly trumpeted by major mainstream news outlets. This is not to say that these relationships have altered dramatically, but rather that WikiLeaks and Anonymous, through a determination to challenge global hegemonies, have thrown down the gauntlet in front of those in power by laying bare some of the practices of authority hidden from public view. As academics, such challenges are worthy of deeper examination, as they are at the heart of the democratic ideals both academia and journalism profess to uphold.